Hello. Today I'm going to talk with you about the recent success the UAW had in a representation election held at the Volkswagen vehicle assembly plant located in Chatanooga, Tennessee. A few weeks ago, as you may have noticed, the press has provided extensive coverage of this election. The UAW succeeded for the first time at a so-called transplant assembly plant. Those are vehicle assembly plants owned by a company based outside the United States. Plants in the U.S., but the company is based elsewhere. And the UAW has not had success at organizing any of the transplants. They started to try and organize transplants shortly after the transplants started operating in the early 1980s. There's a significant number of transplants now producing vehicles. They produce a sizable share of the cars and trucks sold in the U.S. And the UAW, led by a new president, Scheinman, who was elected directly by the membership. Sean had led the UAW in a very successful effort at contract bargaining with the so-called Big Three, GM, Ford, and Stellantis last fall. And he came out of that negotiation and said that he would turn his attention and devote substantial resources to seeking to organize the transplants. In addition to the transplants, another important vehicle plant that's drawn the attention of the UAW is the Tesla plant that operates in Northern California. It's also unorganized. Now, the press has hailed this UAW victory as a turning point, potential turning point, and not only in the organization of vehicle plants in the U.S. that are transplants or Tesla, but also as a potential sign that the labor movement would rally behind this and now succeed at organizing more extensively in the South, where, as you know, unions, not only the UAW, have had a harder time organizing than they have had in the North. So what's the importance or implications of the UAW's victory? My sense is that this is important. It's important that the UAW won this vote. But I'd be hesitant to overstate its importance. And I'll explain why I feel that, although a lot remains to be seen in subsequent elections that will occur, and I'll talk a bit about those likely elections. What's important is that the UAW won. They won in a vote. The UAW had tried to organize both production and skilled trades workers at that VW plant in earlier elections. They had not succeeded. In two earlier elections, they had won representation in between those two broad elections for a union of skilled trades workers, but then they agreed to drop that representation when VW agreed to hold a second election for a unified comprehensive unit representing both production and skilled trades at Chatanooga. Now, what I am also taking note of, and I think this is important, is that there was a very substantial turnout of potential voters in that election. As I recall, it was 84% of the eligible workers voted, and the margin of victory was substantial. They won in the mid-70s of those that voted. That's important. Now, why am I hesitant to say that this is a major turning point? Well, in part because the UAW didn't face the kind of heated, aggressive opposition to organizing that they commonly face in the South or in other plants in rural areas in the United States, or even in some plants in the North. At the corporate level, Volkswagen took a more hands-off stance towards the UAW, in part, I think, reflecting the fact that VW has a deep and generally favorable relationship with E.G. Metall that represents auto workers in the large number of Volkswagen plants in Germany. So they didn't see the kind of opposition, though there was some opposition. You know, there was a letter from several governors of southern states that came out a little bit before the election saying that unions were bad for workers and bad particularly for plants in the South, and it might threaten the viability of those plants. Now, recall in the first election where the UAW came close to winning representation at VW, there had been a lot of opposition within community groups and from politicians. Senator Corker famously got up at a rally and said that unions were bad and that workers should worry about future investment in the plant that would be jeopardized by that vote. That kind of language is of course, illegal for management to state during an election campaign. It's an unfair labor practice, but politicians and others have made those kinds of statements. In any case, there are elections coming up that I think will tell us, and will be a sort of another test of the UAW's campaign, and then also other elections by other unions. In a couple of weeks, the votes will be cast in another auto transplant that's unorganized in the South. It's the Mercedes plant in Alabama. The UAW apparently is launching campaigns, and we're exploring campaigns in many of the transplants, and also potentially looking at Tesla as a place to organize. We'll see what the vote is at the Mercedes plant. Apparently, the UAW went into that vote having presented authorization cards with a somewhat smaller share of the workforce than that they had at Volkswagen when they presented cards before the regional NLRB to get an election. I'm not sure if Mercedes also at the same time represents the kind of test that I'm sort of worried about, where management will be really aggressive in opposing the union. We'll see what happens, and we'll have to learn from other reports about that election as to what occurred surrounding the vote. I also, having studied the auto industry for a number of years, am mindful of the fact that it's not just the auto transplants that are threatening the strength of the UAW. There's a very sizable share of the value of cars and trucks produced in the United States now that occurs in so-called independent suppliers, supplier plants, suppliers to the big three and to other assemblers that are not within the rubric structure ownership of the big three. That share of production has grown enormously, in part through outsourcing of parts, in part because the nature of the value within vehicles is made up importantly of electronic components, and many electronic suppliers are naturally outside the big three and exist in a sector which has very low levels of unionization. When I was doing research for my book, Shifting Gears, I learned that the following data exists regarding the state of unionization in the parts sector, and it really alarmed me at the time, and it continues to trouble me. And that is that right after World War II in the late 1940s, with BLS data, it showed that 95% of the workforces within the independent supplier sector were represented by unions. This is workers in the auto independent supplier sector. And that was mostly UAW representation, but there were some other unions, the IUE and others, that represented workers in the independent suppliers. Well, when I was writing that book in the mid-1980s, and it's continued to this day, data suggests that the unionization level in the independent supplier sector is down to about 5%, a remarkable drop. And again, in those plants, often smaller plants in the South and rural areas, but even supplier plants in the North, the UAW and other unions have not had great success organizing. So it remains to be seen both whether the UAW can extend its organizing activity into auto assembly plants, the transplants, where they might face more heated opposition. And it also very much remains to be seen if the UAW can reverse its fortunes in the independent supplier sector. Time will tell, but I think it's a really important sector to keep our eyes on. The UAW has historically been the leader bringing into U.S. collective bargaining many of its core features, multi-year contracts with COLA clauses, first pensions, and life insurance were brought into U.S. collective bargaining through efforts of the UAW. So it's a really important sector, even beyond the number of workers and the share of production that it represents. But we'll be talking about it more. Take care.